philosophy matters.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? So this is the first ever live stream premiere of ZeroState here with your host, Jack Lloyd, and I'm pretty excited. I've been wanting to do this for a long time because, I had done a lot of different things with Liberty stuff, whether it was, doing memes, comic books, writing articles, music videos, and this and that. And I'm like, you know what? It's time to actually get out there and start talking a bit more frequently with everybody else who's in the Liberty sphere and getting a pulse on what's going on out there, trying to change minds, influence the culture with philosophy. And for that tonight, I actually have a very special guest who I'm excited to bring on. And he's someone who I've actually been on his show a number of times too. So it's pretty special to be able to bring him on for this, as I've been so graciously been able to be on his show a number of times. But before I do that, just want to have a quick reminder here. If you don't already know, me and Fa have a major music video project going on for I Did Not Consent. So we have our next music video that is going to be produced coming up. So you should definitely check that out if you haven't. It's on Indiegogo. I Did Not Consent's the name of the song. It's a rapcore track, hard hitting, lots of fun, but we want to take it to the next level with a, I guess you could say a more mainstream competitive aesthetic, and really try to, push the culture back against all these Hollywood central planners and their music that just tries to get people to love the state and disassociate from the reality of what's going on. So we want to, hit hard with the state tyranny. So without further ado here, I'm bringing on board Jacob Daniel. He is not only, the host of Daniel 3 Biblical Anarchy, he's also a PA Mises state organizer, and he's also an elected libertarian. So welcome, Jacob Daniel. How you doing?
I'm fantastic, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. And with being an elected libertarian, what position was that?
So I was elected to constable for my local borough.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what does that actually entail for your responsibilities?
So the only thing I'm required to do is really to show up on poll day. Like the only thing, like if I don't do that, I could get in trouble, I guess. But really anything else that you could do are things that I'd have to elect for training to do, which a lot of it's very authoritarian in nature. So I wouldn't really want to do it unless it was like to take, like some people try to get like really creative with how to put a monkey wrench in the system. And I don't know if it's worth, it's like, even if you could, I was like, it might be better to spend that money and time doing other things that are more effective than that. But, at the very least, me taking the position prevents somebody else from taking it and using it in authoritarian ways. And, if I choose to run for higher office in the future, like for mayor or city council or something like that, then this is just like a little feather in the cap to be like, oh, I served as constable for blah, 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 which, people care about, I don't care about, but a lot of people will be like, oh, you were elected before, so you have now special recognition and credentials and authority to, run for something else.
Right. And that's always a fascinating discussion, the idea of to what extent can someone, run for an office and still try to uphold libertarian principles, and dismantle, especially with all the different pressures and lobbying, things like that. In your experience so far, I mean, you said it wasn't too involved, but have you found it difficult to try to stay principled in the position?
I wouldn't really. I mean, sometimes it's difficult when you're talking about this with non-libertarians to like explain, your positions and stuff. But as far as like, abandoning my principles and stuff, that really hasn't. I mean, I would vacate the position tomorrow if at any point I felt like it was a conflict between my principles and this position. I kind of reluctantly did it as part of a push in the PA State Libertarian Party. They have this special trick here where they're able to, they've been able to put a lot of libertarians into elected position. And although people being elected to, auditors and constables and stuff, these positions don't hold a lot of weight or meat that can really, be used as leverage against the state. But at the same time, it increases the total number of elected libertarians and at least pushes the Overton window a little bit in that direction. So, insofar as it didn't require a whole lot on my part and isn't requiring me to make any major sacrifices, and I can walk away from it at any point, it was something I figured, it might as well. It was a low risk, low risk, medium reward kind of opportunity.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where, it's always it's a tough battle to think about, to say, okay, if you were to, kind of go in the path of someone who wants to be like a Ron Paul type or something like that, to what extent could you have meaningful change within the state without compromise? And I've talked with, have you heard of Patrick Smith, who ran for like not for governor in that libertarian campaign? Yeah. So like, I talked with him once, like, just, because he's a, extreme voluntarist, of course, hates the state as much as possible, ZeroState. But he, was thinking of ways to like help remove any type of, state thefts in the process. And I said, well, what if, if you got money from the government, what if you had a giveaway where people would submit your like bumper sticker, for your campaign in your car, and then out of anybody who like shows a picture, sends you a picture of like your, bumper sticker, taxation theft, not for governor thing. What if out of those people you pay their taxes, pay off their taxes, what they would have owed based on the monies that you got, as governor, if you magically got elected? He's like, actually, that's not a bad idea, right? You know what I mean? Just like a fun promotional way to be like, okay, you know what? All right, let's help people who want liberty, pay off their taxes. Like, I'll pay your tax bill out of this money that came from the government, so it's a refund of of your
right
your federal taxes.
No, I like that.
It's just fun ways to try to like think of means to being able to work within the statist paradigm to try to change minds, influence things, but not rationalize it and become a part of the harm in itself. You know what I mean? Trying to actually like undo.
Well, some people that have taken the constable position and actually got the training, what they do is when they're told, because one of the things that you could do is like you can issue warrants. Well, so if the sheriff or a judge hands you a warrant to hand out, you don't agree with it, you can like, I'll get to it tomorrow. You know what I mean? Or like, or like, I couldn't find them. You know what I mean? And delay the process, make it be as poor of a constable as you can be.
Right. Well, I mean, exactly. I mean, there's ways to frustrate things, but I think, as you noted, at the end of the day, the point where you're actually being an enforcement, that's where I think it can be very tricky, in order to be consistently principled. Because if you're a cop and you're enforcing victimless crime laws, or you're a teacher and the very nature of your role is to indoctrinate kids and force them into the schooling paradigm, that gets tougher. Some positions, as you noted, are just, you kind of sit there and don't do anything.
Any engagement into the political process inherently comes with the risk of legitimizing the political process and the authority to some degree, which has always been my reservation with political involvement.
Right.
But I think life is a series of choices that we're presented with, and there's always trade-offs. There's pros and cons, and we just have to evaluate each decision to see, is it is the juice worth the squeeze in that particular situation. And there are some situations where there's going to be some ambiguity, perhaps, in like, oh, are you being consistent in here or there? And listen, I think philosophical and moral consistency are important, but I also think that for some voluntarists and anarchists, that can lead to a sort of like approach where they are like, the amount of actions, the pool of ways to combat the state becomes so small and limited that like they basically just become armchair quarterbacks on the internet complaining about the state while not actually doing anything meaningful to impact it. And I'm not saying that everyone has to take a political route. There are many ways to advocate for our principles. I mean, you and Fo do incredible things with your your art, your music, the voluntarist comics and stuff like that. And I don't want to take anything away from that at all. I think politics is just one tool. Some people are have that skill set and that ability to engage in that effectively. If you can't, you can't. But I just encourage everybody to at least be doing something, and to realize that moving the Overton window means that like Sometimes we got to bring people closer to us, one baby step at a time. And if I can at least convince somebody, that's a statist, that it's better for them to be engaged locally and to care about their local politicians, their mayors, their constables, their sheriffs, their local law enforcement, city council, things like that. That's already a major step in the right direction towards promoting a more voluntary society.
Right. I mean, and I agree with you that there's different stages of incrementalism. And for me personally, I don't care too much the political arena. I find it very yucky and icky to engage in it typically. But I do support those who are principled and are trying to bring about more understanding on Austrian economics and ethics and philosophy while engaged in that realm. And I don't fault the Ron Paul types and people like that who genuinely, are trying to do outreach and change minds within that. And I get it. There's plenty of people who they won't pay attention until it's a political season.
And there's a good way and a bad way to do that. And I think Ron Paul and Rand Paul perfectly demonstrate that, because Ron Paul really never compromised. He got into position and spoke a very, powerful motivational message and just told the truth. Rand Paul tried to play politics too much, you know what I mean, in my opinion, and tried to get in with Trump and try to make all these deals and stuff. And certainly I love how much Rand Paul has been one of the few voices in Congress dissenting against the COVID regime. And insofar as, he does things like that, I really love that he is there. But there's too much in his career where he's, muddied the message and I think betrayed his principles and his father's, legacy a little bit that, I think warrant some criticisms. I think we can go back and look at, compare and contrast his political journey with Ron's. And, Rand might have more names on legislation that has gotten passed maybe than Ron, because Ron basically had, I think, next to the only time I looked into this, I think the only meaningful legislation Ron ever helped get or voted yes on was a tiny little piece of legislation that was selling off publicly owned land back to the private sector, which is there's not many more libertarian legislations that you could possibly support. So so yeah, I mean, there's a good compare and contrast there, is my point, though, between Ron and Rand, as far as the effective engagement into the political process versus where you compromise too much. Because to me, it's but that's on the federal level. Obviously, I think at the federal level, it should just be about garnering attention and promoting the ideas. At local government, there's a bit more room to pass legislation, maybe like nullification stuff, like the 10th Amendment Center proposes and helps people do. And I think that kind of stuff is great. It's not for everybody, and like you said, even I get a sense of it feels icky at times to engage in it, and it's a tightrope. You know what I mean? That it's a very tough balancing act to do, but I think that if people can do it, that they should, because we need to. We're still a minority right now as a movement, and I think that every effort should be made to push the Overton window more in our direction.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree that we need to have as many different levels of engagement as possible in arts and culture, entertainment, politics, the whole gamut of things. And your experience now, you've been, doing this kind of outreach and casting and talking to people for a number of years now. So in your experience, what have you noticed in your journey that's been the most common themes of people giving you pushback on, especially in your line of work? Where would you say has been the most friction for you?
Well, I've gotten a lot of pushback from my fellow Christians, unfortunately, because a lot of them deeply misunderstand the Bible and don't seem to take kindly to someone just asking them to read more than one or two verses taking out of context, but to read it into just start with a chapter. We don't even need to read the whole book. Just start with reading an entire chapter from start to finish and not taking verses out of context. That would be an improvement for your average evangelical Christian statist. But so I get a lot of pushback there. And then I get a lot of pushback I don't know, sometimes from people who are supposedly my allies, but that are confused, that seem to have a set of priorities, I think, that just seems rather tone deaf, and seems to be playing into identity politics and to a sort of cultural war that, I think as libertarians we should try to avoid, because there's just more important things going on. It's like I would love to not have to talk about, transgender or GSM issues, and I would love not to talk about my personal religious views on those topics, or to have those conversations. But there's a certain subset of libertarians that very loudly and very obnoxiously at times like to go after other libertarians who said, maybe the government locking people in their homes and telling you can't go to work without getting a jab, and genocide going on in Yemen, and the world's biggest prison population, and the hyperinflation that's setting in, and massive breaks in the supply chain, and people losing their livelihoods, and cities being burned down. I mean, it's like, the fact that I choose to focus on those things, and that I don't feel a need to loudly virtue signal about certain niche, things in a certain that some people hold in a certain, worldview of like a sort of culturally, socially progressive mindset, which I don't care about, unless you decide to force that upon me, either through the state, or strangely enough, some libertarians want to push that in a top-down way in the culture or the party. Which, so I'd say those are the two main areas I've gotten a lot of pushback from.
What's interesting is how you note that that concept of single issues focus and a myopia on something that someone just really cares about, even though it's not technically important to the bigger picture of trying to get state control out of our lives and ending wars and ending the violence, how that is something that pervades, even past someone becoming a libertarian, how that's still something that people fight over and get really, worked up about. And I just think it's one of those things where everyone has to be, within the whole paradigm shift, be reminded often of what is actually the root of all these problems.
Yeah.
And I think that once you start to peel away, the superficialities of people's dysfunctions and like what type of subjective lifestyle that they want, it's like, hold on, chill out for a second with all that stuff. Why don't we go back to like the actual primordial violence of the government and the mass murder and the conscription and rationalization for interventionism and breeding up people to be warriors for the government, and shaming kids in school and stressing them out for years to follow whatever the government dictates. And let's think about all these ways that helps to foster these social symptoms that people may complain of in terms of just whatever dysfunctional lifestyle choices someone may have.
Yeah. Oh, and to be fair, there's plenty of Christians that do the same thing. I don't even mean to just call out the more socially progressive types, but those are the ones that push back on me the most. But I try to, also, to be fair, call out my fellow Christian, libertarians or liberty-minded people, some of which who I think have just, they're playing the same game but from the opposite side. And it's just, I mean, and listen, and I don't run away from the fact that as a, I have a more conservative bend as far as my religious beliefs go. And, I if someone asks me what my views are on homosexuality or gender identity and stuff, I'm going to take a socially conservative stance on those things. But at the same time, that's not my priority. And I don't think that those are even, biblical godly priorities. I think that, if we look at the teachings of Jesus, and the call to care for the least of these, and when Jesus admonishes his apostles to not be like the people of the time who seek to rule and lord over each other, and to be archists over each other, is the way he put it. And the radical message of border. I don't think Jesus was a pacifist, but I think he teaches a message that is so close to pacifism. I understand why people confuse it to it. But the fact that we have all of those things I listed, all the violence going on, I think those have to be, if you're a Christian or a libertarian, I think those have to be your priority more so than these, things that are just, to me, just so, they're not even secondary. They're like, you know, that they're so low on the list of priorities. In terms of the things that I care about, and I think that we need to focus on. I think that actual violence and actual um, coercion matter a lot different than just differences of opinion on what's the best way to live a meaningful or moral life. And there's always going to be disagreements over that. And I feel like some people, like, it's just they're too easy. They're too willing to be useful idiots for the state. Because insofar as people focus on these dumb culture war battles, the state continues to win because that's how you know, they keep us distracted with fighting each other instead of recognizing it's like, oh, we're fighting over the fact that you don't agree with my lifestyle. Meanwhile, we're arguing about this while we are chained hand and legs and conscripted and uh, coerced into either losing half of our wealth or coerced into fighting all these violent wars. Or it's just it just people are unfortunately not awake and they need woken up. And then some people who wear the mantle of libertarianism, when they continue to act as if they're asleep, I find it especially upsetting because they're muddying the message.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's a difficult balance to have there, and to really try to convince people the principles in a consistent manner. And on that note, I was curious: have you ever encountered someone who, in your date with them about these topics, talked about the concept of trying to make sin itself like illegal? Like like someone ever tried to say to you that like we need to like harmonize state and like biblical law kind of thing?
Oh yeah, there's some out there, both who pretend to be libertarians and then some who just unabashedly, you know, aren't libertarians. There are some Christian theonomists out there who want to bring back, the old covenant Mosaic law and make it the law of the land, which just seems silly to me because it didn't even work back when it was initially given to the people. It's like, why would it work any better now? Again, some people have a very special cherry-picked reading of the Bible. And there's some libertarians that seem to, or liberty-minded people that seem to have a focus on, um, and on one hand, I can see where they're coming from, and insofar as I'm a Christian and an anarchist, and I wear multiple hats, I can agree with them that I certainly don't want to promote lifestyles that I think are bad for society, but there's just a hierarchy of values there, and also the way in which I advocate for those different things. Like I can have opinions about people's lifestyles or choices, but the way to engage in those conversations is in a civil way and trying to persuade people and trying to convince them with the efficacy of my arguments or living by example and maybe trying to inspire people to live what I would define as a better life by showcasing that. But to use violence or coercion to push those preferences of mine on people is a violation of the very principles that I believe in. Because insofar as I am a libertarian and a Christian, I think both of them necessitate that I refrain from using violence or coercion against people who are not, who are not using violence or coercion. And I just think there's an obvious hierarchy there in both libertarian theory and in Christian theology that is to me self-evident if you take the time to read the relevant literature on both. But there's a lot of people in both camps who like to cherry pick just like things completely out of context and run a mile with it. What I mean? Like there's a lot of people that have uh read just like a smack, like I read a couple chapters out of context of Hoppe and Rothbard, but haven't read any of Mises, haven't read any of Hayek, haven't read any of Bastiat. I think they've just taken like surface level snippets from highlights from some popular introductory works In the same way, some people in Christianity are just like, well, I did a Google search on this topic and found a page that, shared a lot of, one verse out of context. It's just, and it's a very common theme between both, that people are just intellectually lazy. But that's why I do what I do, because I think the only again, insofar as they're misrepresenting the ideas that I think are important, all we can do is try to persuade them and to persuade others with better ideas. And so that's why I do what I do, is I try to showcase where their ideas are wrong, where they haven't read the entirety of the Bible, or they haven't read enough, libertarian writings. It's especially, I can't believe there's a lot of people that are Misesian libertarians and that haven't like read the relevant literature on private law, that haven't read the like relevant literature on like reciprocity in the enforcement of property rights, people that somehow still engage in the tragedy of the commons. I mean, it's just like, you know what I mean? It seems silly to me. I don't know. When I call myself something, it's like I take that label very seriously. You know what I mean? Like, to me, it'd be really silly to call myself a Muslim and I've never read the Quran. It'd be very silly of me to say I'm a fan of the Aquaman comics and I've never read Aquaman comics. You know what I mean? But for some reason, there's a lot of people that like to call themselves libertarians or Christians, but they have this weird aversion to reading the relevant literature. And I don't get it.
I think there's a lot of excitement, just like, as you may have seen in your own path and journey, that there are people who get excited about, becoming a Christian, right? And they're like, oh my gosh, I just want to like do everything and be everything and be an activist and all this other stuff. But they haven't actually like done a lot of self-knowledge work or a lot of reading about, the history and the theology and eschatology and the whole, gamut of things. And I think the same thing happens with the principles of liberty, that some people get exposed to like some of the superficial concepts, like the nap, and the idea of property rights, just the superficial, and like, oh yeah, I want freedom, but then they don't really internalize it, and very quickly any inconvenience is enough to upend that initial fire, because they didn't really have the principles rooted down and philosophically thought through. It was just kind of like an exciting experience, and this is new,
right?
And thrilling,
and when a statist who has never pretended to be a libertarian comes at me with like, oh, but what about, what are we going to do about public parks, or what are we going to do about radical leftists who want to use the universities and use public education to adopt? And it's like, okay, I get when people who aren't libertarian get confused by these things, but then when people who are big proponents of libertarianism come at me with these objections, I'm just like, the answers are, and they act like the objection is unique or like never been made before. And I'm like, again, it just showcases, I think, a lack of intellectual rigorousness to look into these things more deeply and to see that we have the answers. I think people confuse the argument that it seems like it's a good argument in these people's favor, but I think it's actually a logical fallacy, is they go, well, we don't live in libertarian paradise today, so obviously there's something wrong with libertarian ideas. I'm just like, that's like saying that back when like Galileo or Newton or Einstein or Edison, when they came up with these novel like scientific theories as pioneers in their fields, it's like, was the light bulb a false invention because the minute it was invented, suddenly the entirety of the world didn't have households all filled with light bulbs? Right. Or, was the steam engine any less scientifically valid just because it took a while to implement and to be, for the infrastructure to be built up and stuff? Or was the law of gravity wrong when not a lot of people knew it or understood it? It's just, again, it's just, to me, very childish reasoning and thinking. And I don't mean that to be offensive. I think, children can be quite smart, actually, but I don't know. I can't think of a better word for it. Just very like people who are still drinking milk and haven't moved on to bread or to meat. They're just content for they want they conflate simplicity with truth, which isn't always wrong. Like sometimes the truth is rather simple, but sometimes the truth is something that you can't fit in a fortune cookie or you can't fit in a quick little 240 character tweet. You know
Right.
what I mean? It's like again, it's like, I mean, sometimes you can make things sound simple, like libertarianism is don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. Yeah, that sounds rather simple. But then when you get into the nit and gritty of everyday life, like there are some situations that you just can't give a 30-second answer to. Oftentimes because people present hypotheticals or situations where they haven't given you all the variables or all the relevant information, and you just have to do some intellectual digging. It's just, I don't know.
No, I agree with you. I think that the core issue that you're getting to before, with so many people just readily saying, well, it's not libertarian enough around here. Well, we can't be abiding by principles. It just doesn't make any sense in terms of what the principles are, which is, to me, and what I try to communicate to everybody it's firstly an inner practice, right? I'm not libertarian because of the sake of other people per se itself. It's for me because I understand that when I respect other people and their stuff, and I'm conscious about consent, I'm going to have better relationships for myself. I'm going to have less conflict in my life because it's just a natural root of conflict is this disrespect of other people and their consent and their property rights and things like that. So, to me, it starts there. It starts at the individual. And then after that comes with, when you yourself understand it well, sharing that with others and so on and so forth. But those principles are not something to just be abdicated just because you can't immediately have ancap standard solution, the next day. It's like, no. These are the principles, the philosophical foundations that when you follow these, it leads to observable empirical peace and mutual understanding and respect. And you can't be like, well, I guess because it's not going to, be perfect tomorrow, I should start making things
Right.
worse by
Which
not.
is silly. I mean, it's like we don't oppose murder and theft because everybody's universally accepted that those or acts out that, I mean, you know, there are murderers and thieves out there, but we still reject the idea that murder and theft are morally legitimate. I think for some people it's almost, it reminds me of the parable of the sower from the Bible when Jesus talks about some of the seeds that land in their roots. It's like very shallow ground and the roots go wide but not very deep. And so the minute, like the storms of life came through, there wasn't enough to hold on to. And there's a lot of people who are libertarians who have either completely left or who are, maybe good libertarians, but on a couple of issues, I think that, they didn't do enough digging. And I don't, it's fine. You can't understand, you can't read on everything, and I'm not expecting everyone to have all the answers to everything. Sometimes people have questions for me, and I go, you know what? I don't know, but I assume the answer can be found. I don't immediately go, oh well. The first time I'm encountered by something, I don't immediately have a nice witty retort to that. Oh, libertarianism must be wrong. And the one thing that I think too is that it's actually wrong to say. I mean, and it's like I get what they're saying when people say, "Well, we don't live in Ancapistan today," but at the same time, it's like compared to what? Like, do we live in anarchy compared to the hypothetical ideal where the society we live in has no state? No. But do 99% of our interactions with human beings in society happen in an anarchistic fashion? Well, yes, 100%. Like, otherwise, society actually could not function. Like,
Right.
we would all be like, the state is not a powerful enough or efficient enough entity to actually keep everybody from murdering each other and stealing from each other and from society crumbling apart. It's actually because anarchy works that insofar as the state is actually an agent of chaos and sows all this destruction, what they're still limited in their scope, and the vast majority of human interactions are still voluntary. You know what I mean? And so you always have to, compared to what is a sort of like one of the most useful heuristics that I ever discovered when I got into libertarianism, because it's just like, and I think that's one of the most effective arguments that some libertarians seem to have forgotten, which is that like the vast majority, and this is so easily demonstrated. It's like, unless someone's being intellectually dishonest, or they're like an actual sociopath, like, you know what I mean? Like if you just ask them about like, listen, describe to me everything that happened in the past week and all the interactions you had with people. And are you going to tell me that the minute the state ceases to exist, that every one of those interactions would have ended in violence? That the only reason that you, engage in voluntary trade and don't try to steal from people or don't try to rip them off is because of the state. I think the other thing too is, that the idea that rules can only exist through the assertion of a state. Which again, there's a lot of libertarians that seem to have not done enough reading on the relevant literature on private law and how, read Chaos Theory by Bob Murphy. Like, I don't know what else to tell you. Like, if there's one book, like a lot of people are always talking about Anatomy of the State or talking about, there's a lot of great books out there, but a vastly underrated book, and person in general, is Bob Murphy, because I think he does as good a job as anybody I've ever read or consumed content from at explaining how you can have law enforcement and how you can have private security and defense without assigning those things to a monopolistic entity that actually fails to provide those services, because the state doesn't actually keep us safe. Like, the vast majority of deaths of Americans over the last 100 years have been caused by the state. And insofar as we have been attacked, it's been because of the state. And so the only time the state does anything even remotely useful under any analysis is when they're barely accidentally solving problems that they created in the first place.
Right. Just to get back to something that you said before with the compared to what, and that thinking that through, even with what you just said, recently about the government and the murder, if you're not comparing and thinking about what the government's actually doing, it's very easy to be like, oh, well, without them, we'd have all this murder and stuff like that. And meanwhile, the government's murdered more people in state democide, that is governments in the world in the 20th century, than all the private murders combined.
Without the state, who would stop people from stealing?
Yeah. And the government steals more than any, warlord mafioso could ever dream of, right? The U.S. government literally steals in the tune of trillions, more than, GDP levels, and, and total annual GDP. So this is something that you really need to do a compared to what for when it comes to, thinking about the philosophy of the state and state action, because anybody who's trying to argue with about it is themselves, of course, having to have their own idea of what should be. And I always say that anyone who is trying to critique in the realm of philosophy, but without providing their own comparative, is hiding in the ambiguities, because this is not something where it's like, a video game and you only pick this thing or you pick this like perfect ideal map kind of thing. It's like, no. You have to deal with the reality of what is, right? So you can't sit there and say, oh, your idea of like what we're striving for is bad, but then ignore, okay, well, what do you want? Or what do you think is good, right? There's going to be a substitute good for what it is that you're proposing if you're rejecting that solution, or the libertarian solution. So, bringing that up and making those comparisons, thinking through what somebody else is offering, comparing it to the real world of, not the platitudes of what's taught in state school, but the actual empirical action of the government, I think is absolutely critical and important. So I'm glad you brought that up with the compared to what for philosophy.
Yeah, no, and part of the problem too is just that, I mean, I should be more gracious, because so many people have been so damaged by public schools that their critical thinking faculties are just so underdeveloped that, it's understandable why maybe some people are failing to come to these conclusions, which is why homeschooling is so important, and something that I've been trying to be a bit more vocal about over the last 2 years of the COVID regime, is just to push people to be like, your kids are kind of being forced to stay home anyway. Maybe just, don't keep trying to put them back in these, indoctrination prisons that are, deciding that, uh, they're they're still. It's funny. It's like you didn't have to stop paying your school and property taxes during all that, time that your kids weren't being schooled and stuff.
Right. Yeah, no
Just
refunds on that one.
no. So yeah, I think that there's some understandable uh reasons why we are in some ways fighting an uphill battle, but I don't know, like I just want libertarians to not be making the battle harder by being bad libertarians.
I think, that idea is something that is very close to my heart, because I've been doing that kind of stuff for many years, trying to help, steer the direction, push back against bad actors. And over the years, I've watched many bad actors, come and go, get ostracized or get corrected, sometimes softly, sometimes gently, sometimes very roughly. But yeah, it's one of those things where, I don't control what other people do. And obviously you don't have that power either. You're not like controlling other people do. But I think it is important to rebuff people who try to water down the message, especially where they have a position of like being able to reach a lot of people, and their solution is to rationalize more state control, or trying to, water down the negative consequences of relying on the state. And I think that's very important to have that consistent philosophical outlook applied, for everybody, is to get everybody on board with the idea the state is not the solution to your problems. You got to keep thinking outside the state. Like, don't default to that, because that's what the government does. They want you to think, oh, there's nothing else that could be done. It's just the government or chaos, So
Yeah, and I think the indoctrinate excuse me, throat did a weird thing there. The biggest thing that we're fighting against is the indoctrination of the masses, and it's so important to at every corner be pushing back against the normalization of this violence done on this massive scale. And so that's why, like, even and at the same time, this is juxtaposed with trying to reach people where they're at. And I recognize there's a balancing act there. But I think there are usually ways that we can make our ideas palatable without actually watering down our idea. Like, I don't even think I'm okay with watering down our ideas. What I'm not okay with is muddying our ideas. Like, sometimes it's okay to like dilute something to give somebody a small sample of it if they're not ready for the full blown truth. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And I do that sometimes when I'm talking to people. Then I'm just like, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to convince this person that taxation is theft, and that the military industrial complex is a problem, and that the Federal Reserve, what I mean? It's like, okay, but like, let me find something that they are open to and give them a sliver of the truth, and
Right.
and plant a seed, and that's fine.
Yeah.
What we shouldn't do is be taking statist positions and trying to come up with ways to bend over backwards and make like pseudo libertarian arguments to justify statist positions. And again, I'm not talking about, like, there are some, I think, legit wedge issues in libertarian philosophy that this isn't what I'm talking about. Like, if a libertarian should be pro or anti-abortion is, for an example, a very tough issue. Um, Even what we do, I think most good libertarians agree on the end goal with immigration policy. I recognize that there is some, I think, good faith arguments on both sides of that issue in terms of like, well, what do we do right now? Do we have totally open borders? Should we have a more decentralized approach? Should we have more Ellis Island style immigration? I mean, I think most libertarians, even the ones who aren't for open borders, are not going to be for, totalitarian, like giant walls, or, gunning people down for trying to enter a country and stuff. But I don't think you have to be vehemently, loudly pro open borders in the here and now to be a good libertarian. But there's those other issues that you and I have talked about before, where I don't think that they're as complicated. Really, it's just, for me, it's like immigration and abortion are those two sort of like hard issues to, like, even though I have particular opinions on both of them, I'm not going to maybe focus on those issues as much as other ones, in terms of, like, if there's a libertarian out there who's putting out a vision of what the libertarian answer is on that I don't 100% agree with. Like, I'm not going to choose to fight them on that as much as if they were, if you're trying to make a libertarian argument for war, or for why we should be, you know, why we should have all these military bases, or if you're making pseudo libertarian arguments for why we need lockdowns and vaccine mandates, if
Right.
you're making pseudo libertarian arguments for why we need to increase the police state, that's where I start to take issue, because I mean, um, I think that those are areas where we can make those arguments effectively, and I don't think that the answers are um that hard to explain.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I agree that there's definitely issues where many libertarians divide about their incrementalism, where it is they want to go, step by step. For me, I mean, I just laugh at it because to me, it's a lot of policy fantasy. And I always say it to people, I try to remind them, I say, what do you control? Like, are you the president or something? Are you a governor? You sheriff, border patrol, like head, DHS head? I'm like, all right, so you're not changing anything, right? Let's just cut the crap,
Right.
all that BS.
You're never going to advocate for a state
Right.
solution in which the state doesn't weaponize it for their own growth.
Right.
And you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I'm going to contradict myself here a little bit, but this is what eventually got, like, when I first became a libertarian, I still was against open borders. And I eventually dropped that because I realized, like, I was worried about the state having control of the border. I mean, having open borders, because I was afraid that they were going to use that to grow their power and influence. And I'm not saying they won't, but it's like, but okay, so what's the other solution? To give the state more power in
Right.
hope that it limits itself? It's like,
Right.
that just seems especially autistic. It's just like, you know what I mean? It's like, it's
I
not going
know
to work.
how big the government is. They're
Right.
so bad. They murder so many people. They steal so much money that we need to give them control over thousands of miles of land and air and sea, and make sure they have the sufficient tools to monitor every single person coming in and out.
Right.
It's one of those things that when you like get to the specifics, because I just hate that. Just hate when people work in abstractions on those things. It's like, no. This is real world stuff. This isn't like what happens if a unicorn farts. This is, what does the government do with your money, with actual armed, guards? What are they doing to your bodies in the airport? What are they doing at border checkpoints? What's the laws actually, on the book saying about, what they can do to you? How are they dealing with this now? And to me, it's just comedic, because it's like, in the real world, the U.S. government right now, federal government, literally takes in people crossing the border, buses them in, and then ships them out to other states, right? So like, despite it being illegal to cross the border, the little freaking government right now is bussing in people and shipping them and then just dropping them off in other states, to like, they're trying to weaponize immigration by that policy. The point being is that those in the government who are corrupt and evil, as we aptly describe, are going to do anything they can to manipulate no matter what, even when it's illegal. They're going to say, like, oh, where'd that, because they were running buses like Tennessee and stuff. And like, there's a bunch of governors who are suing over this, but it's just like, it's a silly thing to, kind of debate over when it's not in your power to control anyway. The government is not going to ethically and effectively manage whatever it is that you're trying to get them to do in your ideal, vision. And on top of that, it's in no way, shape, or form going to get more people on a principled mindset of the government's not the solution to the problem, right? If you're sitting there and debating, saying, oh, maybe the government can do this thing right. It's like, well, you've already lost the philosophical battle. It's over, because now you're getting someone to think, the government could manage some things right. No. The government cannot ethically, effectively manage anything right. The solution is, how do we get the government out of the situation? How do we, decentralize? How do we secede? How do we abolish? Not, how do we get the government to just, do this one thing magically right? Well, we know they screw up everything else. So it's just really, it's one of those, it's like a slapstick comedy thing. You know what I mean? It's a true irony.
Yeah, it is. And insofar as, I earlier was saying that I think there's room for political involvement. The danger, I think, is that some people become very single focused, and they forget that politics is not the only tool in the tool bag. You know what I mean? It's like I'm a mechanic, and it's funny, when I was going to this new job, and I told them I had two toolboxes. They were like, "What? Like, why? Like, why do you have so many tools?" It's like, I like to have the right tool for the job. I like to have a wide variety of tools because you never know what you're going to encounter. And I always use this analogy for libertarian activism. I want to have as many tools as I can, but not every tool is good at every job. Not every problem is a nail that needs hammered. You know what I mean? As the expression goes. So, some problems need solutions and benefit from solutions that aren't available in the political realm. And I think that's a trap that sometimes people who are, in the political arena fall prey to, is be like, again, like there are some things where decentralization and political involvement is great, but then agorism is good. You just engaging, not even in gray markets, just engage in the regular markets and come up with. I mean, think about how much Uber, for example, not even a libertarian venture, but just think how much Uber has helped to break up monopolies and unions and all that, in like New York and other states where those things were such an entrenched system.
Right.
Think about the whole, we talked about this on my show, the homelessness in parks problem, and it's like, why wouldn't the number one libertarian answer be to create more market alternatives to the state commons? Like, stop trying to come up with political solutions to make the state commons suck less.
Right.
They're still gonna suck. Like, our focus should be, and I think, and it's like, we have limited time and resources, so we should always focus on, like, sometimes you can use a tool towards a certain end, but it's going to be so wildly inefficient. It'd be like using a hammer and a chisel to take a bolt off. Like, you can do it, but should you? Or like using a wrench to hammer a nail. You can do it, but should you? Is there ways to make the commons maybe technically suck a little bit less? Like, I don't know, like maybe, but also like, is that even a useful mental exercise to engage in? And even if you do, through some miracle, accomplish a small measure of good through advocating for like some kind of state solution, is the good you're achieving even comparable to the good you could have achieved if you use the same efforts elsewhere?
Right. It's beautifying theft and rationalizing state central planning in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
And it's like, as I think we talked about this before, it's like even in North Korea, right? It's very obvious that their stupid ski slope resort that they use as the North Korea government's so great. They have this ski resort. It looks like it's from the 80s, but that's their flagship attraction to come on over from, tourists around the world. See, come ski our slopes, and they cry like the North Koreans, native ones. Like, it's really sad. They're crying like, oh my gosh, he's so nice. He gave us a ski resort. He's an amazing ruler. But that's exactly it, right? Like, in that context, it's obvious. It's like, oh, duh, of course, the government's stealing from everybody and they're robbing people, making them poor, and they're using this as their promotion for the government. Of course, it's obvious. Like, that's bad. But here in America, it's like, oh, there's a dog park. Oh, it's got a lot of homeless people. We need to, the government needs to clean that up. It's like, whoa. And
these public parks with these equipment that's falling apart and covered in rust, and the swings are rotty, and every time the kids are, like, I've been to parks where like I don't let my kids on the swing because like they're not properly posted, and like the bars are like pulling out of the ground, or it's like they haven't remulched in a while and kids fall down and hurt themselves more. It's like, oh, but at least there's not homeless people. It's like, you wouldn't advocate for that for like a bad restaurant, would you? Like, if a restaurant was like, oh, we serve you cold food that is bland and unseasoned and it doesn't look good, and the atmosphere is like, we don't, the thermostat set to like the hottest setting, so you're just like sweating the entire time you're waiting for your food and stuff, and the bathrooms suck, but hey, look, there's no homeless people here. It's like,
right,
okay, but this still sucks.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just one of those things that until people get comfortable with just saying, hey, the government's not the solution here, let's think of private solutions, it's very difficult. You have to get over that hump.
I think some people are just like, they're so like, you get fatigued from always fighting the fight. And you like, then you'll hit, there's one issue where there's this temptation, like, I'll just give them this one. And it's like, because it'll make me seem more reasonable that like, okay, fine, you can have your violent state monopoly here. It's like, but that's just giving in. And that's not something we should do.
Exactly, right. People want to seem like as if they're palatable, and some of these same people are quite comfortable criticizing the Beltway libertarians and the DC, people who are in the different corporations and not for profits and stuff like that in that circuit, right? They're like, oh, these people just want to be accepted and tolerated by the establishment, right? And it's like, yeah, that's pretty bad to compromise so you can sound palatable for the mainstream. That's pretty bad. But then it's like, oh, but we can't talk about privatizing the parks. That's just not. I'm like, dude, like 2 seconds ago you're just criticizing these people in DC for kowtowing to the establishment, and now you can't just say, hey, maybe private parks, that's a good solution. Like, that's too much. Like, it's just it's like, come on, like, it's the same principle, right? You're not in it to be loved and to appeal to people's statist tendencies or indoctrination. You're in it to shake people up and be like, hey, this is actually really terrible. Like, let's show you how terrible it is and why consent and privatization and market choices is a lot better.
Yep.
Stuff. All right, well, real quick here, I just want to take a couple quick questions just because I said we could here. I'm not sure if any of these are going to be good, but let's see. Gabriel Hardy says statism indoctrination is the biggest hindrance to understanding liberty. Yes, it's definitely true. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, I personally, have the observation that people naturally wish to be free even as young kids, and it takes a lot of violence to make someone not want to be free in the first place. The Road to Providence, David Brady. I'm not sure if you know who this is. I'm not sure myself, but they said, do you have any thoughts on Tolkien said that politics are best described as an anarchist? I'm not sure.
Oh yeah. Tolkien said that in one of his letters. And yeah, I mean, he had this it was almost a sort of anarcho-monarchism where he thought that in anarchy there'll be like natural leaders who rise up and lead for a time, but it's like but it's a more biblical view of leadership where it's like the ruler doesn't take power through force, but like rather like he's just somebody that is such a actually effective public servant that he's just at the top of that market hierarchy. And it's not right to call it a monarch. I think it'd be more like if you had I don't know, like a corporation in an area that did so good that it became a natural monopoly. You know what I mean? And it doesn't become a natural monopoly through force. The only way a natural monopoly exists in a free market is that like they just provide such a good service for the surrounding community that like nobody wants to compete against them. They want to give them, some people are just like, they do so well in the market that like people just want them to, like, you're thinking like Elon Musk, I guess, kind of. That kind of. I mean, it's not a perfect example, but
I get what you're saying, though, right? If you provide good enough service to people, you just start to naturally aggregate, a lot of fandom, and it grows and grows. I would say you said not monarchy, but it did remind me of anarcho-monarchism, the concept, which is the idea that there's a monarch who is a figurehead, not actually ruling, but they're kind of like a thought leader for liberty. And I think it was C.S. Lewis and Salvador Dali who are anarcho-monarchists. And also was close with dandyism, like, looking really dapper with like a top hat and like dressing fancy and stuff.
Yeah. There's a good bit of Christian anarchists or people who lean towards Christian anarchy, but kind of fooled around with like the anarcho-monarchist kind of thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a fan of it outside of true anarchism. Like if it was actually a true thought leader thing, obviously it would never be for monarchy. Quite clearly on ZeroState would never be for anarchy. All right, so we have a question for Justice. I saw this morning where the U.S. is starting to warn Americans to leave Ukraine ASAP. If Biden does start a shooting war with Russia, what can we do to endure and survive? It's like, well, I don't know. That depends. That's, what I mean? That's wholly dependent on what it is they ultimately do. I don't believe that either of the major parties, I'm collectivizing here, but I'm saying that those in leadership in the Russian government and those in leadership in the United States government, as far as I know for right now, I don't think they're that suicidal. You know what I mean? In terms of a nuclear war kind of thing, I don't buy that typically, because
No, I think it's one of those things where they threaten something incredibly extreme to then make the much less extreme evil thing they do after that seem less extreme. Like, oh, we were threatening nuclear war, but now we just we just let Russia annex more of Ukraine, and we're not going to do any. You know what I mean? It's, I don't know. It's like there's all these. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where it's by and large, right? There's literally thousands upon thousands of nukes when you think about warheads, and they got tons of them in there and stuff like that. Like, if the governments of the world actually went to nuclear war, you'd be screwed. Like, there's no way around it. Your bunker's not going to save you. If they actually like really released all the nukes, it's enough to blow the planet up over a few times. So
yeah,
you know what I mean? You got some bigger problems to worry about. You just gotta, as I say, you just got to rely on the fact that these people don't want themselves to die. That's basically it. Just remember, at the end of the day, these people don't want to die. So unless they got a secret spaceship, some people might say they do, but I don't know. They have the supplies to make it. It's not likely that they want to, risk their own lives. So,
yeah.
And then let me. Oh, he said Jacob knows me. Lamau.
Yeah, David.
All right, and then and then Snorky. I think it's Minnesota. I don't know. Snorky Man. One of the cities in California is buying new condo buildings to put homeless in. I'm sure it's going to go super well.
Yeah. Yeah. California is just a disaster. I don't know how libertarians still exist in California and in New York. Just like, it's just like, I don't know. Some people are like, oh, well, if we give up here, they'll just move to different states. Like, yeah, I get it. But like, I don't know. For me, they just seem like lost causes. But but also at the same time, there's a lot of California and New York that isn't the major cosmopolitan cities. So like, I get there's a lot of it's just it's sad. I don't know what else to say other than that.
I agree. No, yeah, it's sad, and there's nothing holding back those Democrat legislatures in New York and California. They're going to sink the place. So to me, it's like there's no wishful thinking. You're not going to save it at this point. They've solidified their power. They have the supermajority. Everybody's left, right? U-Haul trucks. They're all out of the California, New York. They're out because everybody's who was on the libertarian Republican spectrums. Like, I'm out of here. So those places are done.
But, I do like the one comment by Gabriel Hardy who referenced the passage I mentioned earlier. He said, should more folks know this passage? But Yeshua called them near and said, you know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, but it should not be so among you. Yeah, I wish more Christians read that passage and followed after the example of Jesus, who is said to be a king, but came down and was a servant. So the biblical, and I get what you were saying, like you don't support a monarchy, and I don't support a monarchist or a monarchy or a king in the traditional senses of those words, but like the biblical lens or way of looking at those terms is just like a little bit different because and it gets into translations and all that. But yeah, I think that that's why I do what I do. Is I want more Christians to actually live out. If you're going to call yourself a Christ follower, follow Christ.
Well, and on that note, I'm sure 1 Samuel 8, right, is the whole idea of rejecting the judges for a king and asking for a king. So it's like that whole
you will literally be God says you will literally be slaves. To this king. But they're like, yeah, give it to us anyway. It's like, okay, well that works out well for you. So no, I don't know. Indoctrination is not just something that exists now with public schools. It's existed for all time. So I mean, all we can do is keep telling the truth, and that's what if you want to talk about something very Christian, the truth shall set you free. So anytime you, that's my basic rule. Like whether I'm acting in politics or I'm a constable or whatever, it's like I'm never gonna lie. And if telling the truth makes someone upset, like I'm sorry. Like I'm not gonna lie for your convenience and feelings. That's not good for you. If you love somebody, you tell them the truth.
Right. Yeah, because if you're not telling the truth, then they're believing a false reality about the situation. So that's the pain that will eventually manifest when lies start to build up. So
yeah,
well,
absolutely.
thank you so much. I appreciate Jacob Daniel for coming on. Is there a way for people to connect with you otherwise and follow the work that you do outside of the show?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Biblical Anarchy. The podcast is on YouTube, Odyssey, and all the major audio podcatchers like Apple, Spotify, and etc. So you can find me, Daniel3 Biblical Anarchy. And if you are so inclined to provide any financial support for the show, it's patreon.com/biblical anarchy. Any amount you are able to donate just helps me to be able to produce more content and be more free to, go out there and fight the good fight. So, and thanks again for Jack, to you, Jack, for having me on. I've enjoyed having you on my show, and very honored again to be the first guest on your new show. And I'm excited to see you and Fo continue to go out there and do everything you guys do.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate you coming on. And again, if you missed it, there is a link I put in the video description to his YouTube, stuff like that. So you'll be able to follow him there and check out his other stuff there too. So thank you, Jacob Daniel. I appreciate it. And I'm excited to see what you do next in terms of reaching out to people and helping to convince them that the state's not the solution to their problems. So, all
Absolutely.
right. All right. Take care, everybody. I'm not exactly sure when the next show will be, but I definitely will have you, fingers crossed, everything goes well, back on again at some point to do some more discussion on philosophy and ethics. So